So I got into IT security back in the late 90s, or I'm sorry, excuse me, back in the late 80s with the Air Force. I worked on cryptographic machines and telecommunication equipment in data centers, and I learned a lot of my security background from those days. After that time, I worked for the Marine Corps in Japan for 20 years, working on their network and security. In the early 2000s, I was exposed to a heavy dose of PCI compliance and NIST standards, and that became kind of the foundation of my interest in compliance work. And then in 2014, I joined Structured, where our team performs security assessments, risk assessments, penetration testing, those types of things. So, according to compliance statistics, the three areas or three most common causes of breach for compliance inadequacies is the lack of system logging and the analytics for that logging, as well as vulnerability testing and penetration testing. The difference between a penetration test and a vulnerability assessment is usually, with a vulnerability assessment, we're taking tools and we're using a scanning engine, and basically you're getting back the common vulnerabilities that are found that are already identified in the network, and you're getting a report on that. With a penetration test, what we're doing is we're actually exploiting those vulnerabilities and finding out the true deficiencies within the network as far as security controls. So here would be a key difference. Say on a vulnerability scan, there are remote execution vulnerabilities that are found, and the patches haven't been applied, so the workstations are showing as vulnerable. During a penetration test, we could see if the exploit will actually work on those workstations, because if they're running advanced malware or they're running some kind of whitelisting type of software, they might be preventing that exploit from actually taking place. But you wouldn't see that from a vulnerability scan only. You have to actually do the penetration test to see the true weakness in the exploit. So one of the first questions that I would ask of a customer who's considering some kind of an assessment is whether they have compliance requirements. Is there some kind of overarching compliance requirement for PCI or HIPAA or CGIS or FERPA or some other of the standardized frameworks for compliance? And if they don't, then we use more of a standardized framework. That would be my recommendation, is to use something like a CIS controls or a cybersecurity framework type of assessment. So those are typically the kind of decisions that I would make first, is compliance requirements and then moving into kind of a standardized framework. I think that most organizations, companies, power generation type of utilities, they know of the requirements. It's just a matter of, do they have the expertise on hand to actually meet the requirements that they're supposed to? So are they effectively putting their security program in place to meet all of the compliance requirements and those types of things? So definitely the knowledge is there as far as knowing that there is a requirement, but getting to the specificity of the controls that need to be put in place, sometimes I see organizations struggle with that. I think the strength of having an outside assessor come in, or an audit come in, is the fact that you're getting a fresh set of eyes with an unbiased opinion to come in and give you a critical look at where you are with your compliance program or your security program. I think that's the strength of bringing in an outside organization. Structure has qualifications in numerous security frameworks, like I said, including PCI and HIPAA, CGIS, NERC CIP, as well as the unregulated types of frameworks. So I think getting that outside unbiased opinion is extremely helpful for them to move their security program in a positive way. Even for organizations that don't have a compliance requirement, having someone come in and give you an unbiased opinion on a framework-based assessment is extremely helpful in progressing your security program in the maturity model. I think a lot of organizations fall short in their policy development and maintenance. That's a critical element to a security program. It basically defines everything within a security program, and organizations seem to struggle with that element, especially if there's not a strict compliance requirement. Other areas where I see organizations struggle is inventory of software and hardware assets that are in scope to their environment. Those are areas that always seem to come up routinely on security assessments. Like all findings on a security assessment, having the staff in-house or their expertise in-house to do the policy development or to implement security controls required for security best practice or compliance is one way to go. The other way to go is to bring in outsiders who can provide that that extra bit of push to to bring the policies into compliance or into to do the next best step. When we do an assessment, the output of an assessment is the final report, and the final report is basically a roadmap to compliance. We identify all of the out of compliance controls, all of the findings, and we make recommendations to management as to how they can best meet those requirements, implement controls, and become compliant. Sometimes the customers will work with us directly to make sure that they're implementing them with the auditor's mindset. So they're making sure that they're fulfilling all those requirements. So I think one of the critical elements of a compliance program is having upper level management have a dedicated mindset to becoming compliant and dedicating the resources to make sure that the security staff and the IT staff have the tools that they need to implement security controls or to do policy development and to make sure that all of the compliance requirements are being met. So the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA, is going to affect any business that actually conducts business with the residents of California. It will apply to any business that meets one of the following three criteria. If they do $25 million or more in revenue, if they have 50% of their revenue generated from the sale of privacy information, and if they have 50,000 or more records from the residents of California. It's actually revenue for the company. So if they do business with residents of California, then it doesn't matter where their business is headquartered or where they're located at. They can be anywhere within the country or actually anywhere in the world. I think for companies that have gone through the painful process of becoming compliant with GDPR, they're going to find that most of the requirements in CCPA they're already going to be well positioned to become compliant with CCPA. So I think the first step that most organizations would need to identify would be, do they have any data from the residents of California? Do they do business through an e-commerce website or through any kind of any other means that would put them in the possession of the residents of California data? If the answer to that is true, they have to start taking deeper steps into how they're going to provide the mechanisms for opting out and deleting that kind of data and making sure that they're compliant by the 1st of January. I think it's going to be a blend of policy that, of course, defines how you're handling that information, as well as security and privacy controls that have to be implemented. The privacy controls I mentioned earlier, as far as the ability to opt out, the ability to know what information that a business holds of yours, as well as what information they might have sold of yours. Those mechanisms are going to have to be put in place, I think, with technical controls. They're going to have to be tracked through websites. They're going to have to be tracked through databases and how marketing people within organizations handle that kind of information. I think the key is to define the scope of your involvement in something like CCPA, to find out where and whose data you have and where you're storing it. That will define where the organizational assets you have who are involved. As you mentioned, it could be the marketing department, it could be the contracting department or HR or many numerous departments within your organization. So defining the scope clearly is going to give you the picture, and then after that you can add on the people who are involved with those processes. My favorite type of audit or assessment to conduct is where we go in from top to bottom and we help the customer with data classification and discovery. We perform risk assessments, the output of which can go back to management and help them define exactly the risks that are involved with their organization, and then full security assessment. So a top to bottom approach, help them define their security program and help them develop that security program to where they can further themselves along the security maturity model. We scope the assessment completely to each engagement, making sure that we cover everything for the customer themselves. So it has a tremendous impact on the type of business that they are, the type of sensitive data that they have, and whether or not they already have a security program in place. There are some emerging technologies around vulnerability prioritization. I think those technologies are going to be very helpful for security staff and security managers to make the critical decisions on which vulnerabilities in their network need to be addressed first. And I'm kind of excited to get in and play with those technologies. At a high level, it takes the output of a vulnerability scanning program as well as artificial intelligence inputs and gives a clear prioritization over what types of vulnerabilities are in your network and which ones that you should be attacking first. I mean, sometimes we usually think of prioritizing our vulnerability management in terms of criticality, so the most critical to the lowest. But in certain environments, we find that there may be less criticality to some of the critical findings because of the types of controls that are already in place. Every CISO, every IT director is struggling now with kind of an information overload, and finding a clear-cut way to make those decisions on which ones are really of most importance to the organization is critical. I think one of the aspects that separates our compliance and assessment department is the fact that we have a security engineering background, and we have industry experience. My background is heavily involved with PCI compliance, and some of our team members are heavily involved with the financial industry or healthcare. So having industry experience, I think, lends a lot of knowledge and capability as far as the application of security controls while you're performing an assessment.